Greetings, everyone. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. MFSA is an organization that's over 100 years old. We're a faith-based policy and organizing network, and our mission is to mobilize, lead, and sustain a justice-seeking United Methodist movement, engaging people to be agents of God's justice, peace, and reconciliation. And we co-host a series of webinars with our partner, United Methodist for Kairos Response. As we gather from many places, we acknowledge this land and the many lands that you are joining us from. Its history and all the beings seen and unseen, known and unknown. And as we step into our work on these many lands, most of us as uninvited guests, we offer this work in the spirit of reparation, devoting ourselves to justice as we strive to uplift the legacy of this place and these places. We invite you to acknowledge the indigenous land of where you are joining from and type that in the chat. A few announcements concerning our conversation and call today. By participating in our webinars, we covenant together to co-create an equitable and brave space where we learn, engage, and grow in relationship together. We are recording this webinar, and that recording will be shared in the coming days, so you'll have access to that later. And as you have questions, we invite you to type them in the chat. You don't have to wait for the specific question and answer time. We don't want you to forget your questions, so feel free to add them in the chat and we will make sure we pass those on to our moderator. We do have closed captioning available. It is automatically generated, so do know that you'll see some spelling errors and other errors, but you can access that by clicking the three dots with more underneath and clicking subtitles, show subtitles. Our moderator today is Teresa Basile. Teresa is a member of UMKR Steering Committee and their communications director. She's a member of the board of FOSNA, Friends of Sabile North America, and previously served on the steering committee of U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights. Teresa also serves on the leadership teams of MFSA in the California Pacific Conference and the Western Methodist Justice Movement, both of which mobilize United Methodists for action on a wide range of justice issues. Thank you for being here with us, Teresa, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Bridget. And thank you, everyone, for being here. It's great to see so many people here with us. Let me tell you a little bit about UMKR. United Methodist for Kairos Response is a grassroots movement for Palestinian human rights in the United Methodist Church. Our goal is freedom, justice, and equality for all Palestinians and Israelis. And we engage in boycott and divestment campaigns, political actions to change government policy, and education, such as this webinar, to help our church and our societies understand what is happening in the Holy Land and how we can support the Palestinian people in their struggle for justice and liberation. So this webinar we are having today, in this webinar, we're presenting one of the most important subjects that exists about Palestine and Israel. It's a crucial subject for anyone who wants to understand what is happening today between Palestinians and Israelis. And that subject is the Nakba. That word means catastrophe in Arabic. The Nakba is the catastrophe that befell the Palestinian people in the 1940s when they were expelled from their homeland in vast numbers and their communities and their society were destroyed to make way for the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. Why are we focused right now on the Nakba? Because this month, the entire world is commemorating a very sad and momentous anniversary. This week, in fact, the world has been commemorating the 75th anniversary of the Nakba on May 15th. And for the first time ever, the United Nations officially commemorated the Nakba with events this week. In fact, even some mainstream media in the United States and elsewhere in the world has been telling their readers and their viewers about this terrible anniversary. Nevertheless, this history is not something that most people will hear anything about from their teachers or their political leaders or mainstream media most of the time. It is crucial history to learn, for it is fundamental if we hope to understand what is needed to achieve justice and a lasting peace for the people of Palestine and Israel. And to help us learn about the Nakba, we could not have asked for two more appropriate speakers, Ilan Pappé and Samia Khoury. Ilan Pappé is a world-renowned author, widely regarded as the preeminent voice among Israel's new historians. His courageously groundbreaking work of 2006, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, draws upon previously classified archival evidence and clearly presents to the world the truth about Israel's birth and the ideology that drove it, that the forcible removal of the indigenous Palestinians from their homeland was wholly intentional and was considered essential for the creation of the State of Israel. Ilan Pappé's large body of writing includes A History of Modern Palestine, One Land, Two Peoples, and 10 Myths About Israel, among many other works, and numerous articles of analysis and commentary, including Using the Right Language, the Incremental Genocide of the Palestinians Continues. Professor Pappé founded and directed the Academic Institute for Peace in Givat Haviva and was the chair of the Emil Tuma Institute for Palestine Studies in Haifa. He was a senior lecturer in Middle Eastern history and political science at Haifa University. Today, he is professor of history and director of the European Center for Palestine Studies at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. Besides his focus on the modern Middle East and Israel and Palestine in particular, he has also written on multiculturalism, critical discourse analysis, and power and knowledge in general. We also have with us Samia Khoury. Samia is a Nakba survivor, and throughout her life, she has been a leading voice in the Palestinian Christian community. She has written and spoken widely on all aspects of the Palestinian experience, from her vivid recollections of the Nakba to the current realities of life under the Israeli military occupation. Some of her recollections can be found in her article, The Nakba and Its Aftermath. In her 2014 memoir, Reflections from Palestine, A Journey of Hope, Khoury beautifully explains the wide-ranging social and political problems facing Palestinians under occupation through the sweet and sorrowful experiences of family and community life. Samia was educated in the US at a Methodist-affiliated college, and she is a co-founder of Sabil, the Ecumenical Liberation Theology Center in Jerusalem. She's also a founding member of Birzeit University Board of Trustees and former president of the Palestinian YWCA, among many other roles she's filled in Palestinian society. So welcome to both of you, and it is so good to have you here for this discussion. This webinar is going to be longer than usual because this is such an important topic. We are going to be going for an hour and a half. We're also going to be doing this with an unusual format for us. Interspersed with our live conversation, we will be watching some video clips from an excellent film on this subject of the Nakba. That film is 1948, Creation and Catastrophe. So we're going to start with that immediately. Bridget Cabrera, who you met at the beginning of the webinar, will be managing our technical aspects. And so Bridget, can we please have clip number 1?
For those seeking to understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it is essential to know the events surrounding the creation of the State of Israel, events that culminated in the fateful year of 1948. Jews around the world celebrated the creation of the new state, believing that it would be a sanctuary for Jews after centuries of persecution. But for Palestinians, the creation of Israel was the Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe. Those events included the destruction of hundreds of Palestinian villages. About 750,000 Palestinians became refugees, exiled from their homeland even until today. Jews in Europe suffered greatly from racial prejudice in the 19th century. They were demeaned with offensive stereotyping, subjected to unjust boycotts, and were barred from some schools, communities, occupations, and government positions. Jewish neighborhoods and towns were the targets of violent mob attacks. Looking for a solution, some Jewish leaders developed a plan and a movement that became known as Zionism. Zionists planned for the Jews of Europe to emigrate to a new place where they could have their own state and live in safety. They decided that place should be Palestine. In the late 1800s, Jewish families and communities in Europe started emigrating to Palestine, buying small pieces of land and establishing new communities. Often these purchases were from absentee owners, and the local Palestinians working the land lost their homes. This Zionist colonizing activity continued the tradition of centuries of European colonization of other lands around the world. The colonization of Palestine was justified with a slogan at that time: "A land without a people, for a people without a land." This suggested that the region of Palestine was empty land waiting for European Jews to come inhabit it. But the slogan was untrue. In reality, Palestine had a large population inhabiting it. Indigenous Palestinians had been living in that region for thousands of years. Regardless of this reality, in a letter that came to be known as the Balfour Declaration, the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, stated his government's support for the Zionists' goal: to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. This happened during World War I. After that war and the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, the League of Nations gave Britain the responsibility to administer the region of Palestine, and Britain began to implement the Balfour Declaration. Larger numbers of Jewish immigrants from Europe began to come and settle in Palestine. Soon this led to plans to displace the Palestinians, to find ways of encouraging the Arabs to leave their homes and their land in Palestine. Palestinians saw the growing waves of immigrants and how their own people were losing their homes as a result. They also heard of Zionists' plans to outnumber the Arabs eventually, and they revolted against these plans to remove them from Palestine.
Zionist colonization must be carried out in defiance of the will of the native population. This colonization can therefore continue and develop only under the protection of a force, independent of the local population, an iron wall which the native population cannot break through. Vladimir Jabotinsky, Zionist leader, founded the militant Zionist revisionist movement, 1923.
Let us not ignore the truth among ourselves. Politically, we are the aggressors and they defend themselves. The country is theirs because they inhabit it, whereas we want to come here and settle down, and in their view we want to take away from them their country. David Ben-Gurion, first Prime Minister of Israel, 1938.
The only way is to transfer the Arabs from here to neighboring countries, all of them, except perhaps Bethlehem, Nazareth, and Old Jerusalem. Not a single village or a single tribe must be left. Joseph Weitz, Director, Land Department, Jewish National Fund, 1940.
Thank you, Bridget. And I think now I'm going to be joined on screen by the rest of our panel. There was a lot in there to unpack. Those clips covered more than most of our clips will. I'm wondering, Samuel, we saw you speaking in there, and you brought up that subject of the early Zionist slogan, a land without a people for a people without a land. I'm wondering what you think about that now, and your thoughts about the justification of anti-Semitism, the experience of anti-Semitism that motivated this Zionist plan to come and colonize Palestine. Can you share some of your thoughts about that?
Well, the whole thing, I think, started on the basis of injustice, on a fake statement, that the land was without people. Starting from this point, it's very clear that this was a wrong premise. But at the same time, we realized, that the Jewish community was being suffering in Europe and under Christian, actually, rule for many years. But we didn't have to be the victims. We ended up being the victims of the victims. That was no solution for the Jewish problem, to evict another people and claim, starting from the Balfour Declaration, his promise to establish a Jewish home. And it says establish a Jewish home, not to take over the whole state. And the Jews accepted that, and they knew, even from the partition scheme, that they knew they were going to take the whole land. They were scheming for that and planning for it properly. We were the owners of the land, so we probably took it for granted that this is our land. We didn't do much about it. But the people who is going to steal the land, just like any robber, when you steal something, you have to plan for it. And that's what they did. They planned, and they planned it in a genius way. And of course, you will hear about all the atrocities that they made to get rid of the population, Palestinian population, and create that land.
Thank you. Ilan, is there more that you can share with us about these early events that that led to the birth of Zionism and the beginning of the ethnic cleansing of Palestine?
Yes, I think it's important to understand that there were two impulses behind the Zionist movement, the creation of the Zionist movement. One impulse was indeed, they were among many other Jews who were looking for a way to ease the suffering of Jewish communities, not all over the world, but Jewish communities, particularly in Russia, in Tsarist Russia, who were suffering from pogroms and anti-Semitic policies. Now, of course, there were various ways of dealing with anti-Semitism, and most of the Jews, in fact, opted for being part of wider political movements that hope to make societies in general more equal, less racist, whether some people chose socialism, some people believed in liberalism. Most of the Jews who decided that there's no chance for change within Tsarist Russia moved to the West, to Western countries in Europe, or, as we know, to the United States. Many of them moved to the United States. So among a minority of people, the idea was actually that going to Palestine is the best solution for anti-Semitism, although most of the Jews did not believe in it. The reason that they chose Palestine is the second impulse. And that impulse was very much influenced by Christian fundamentalists, especially evangelical churches, who already before Jews were thinking about it, were talking about the return of the Jews as part of a divine scheme that would precipitate the second coming of the Messiah, the resurrection of the dead. There was a great influence of what today we probably will call Christian Zionists. So let's call them the early Christian Zionists, who started propagating these ideas already in the 1820s, about 60, 70 years before the creation of the Zionist movement. And they planted these ideas in the early Zionists that actually Judaism is not a religion, it's a race, it's a nation. Now, if it's a nation, then it needs a homeland. And then you can see the logical connection between the land of the Bible, from a Jewish perspective, the Old Testament, of course, the land of the Old Testament is being connected to this nation state. Now, even that by itself does not explain to us what happened in the years before the Nakba. What really is important, of course, is that the moment that there were enough allies in the Western world who, for religious reason and then later for imperial reason, in the case of Britain, who believed that actually colonizing Palestine and making it a Jewish state serves their theological or their strategic vision, it gave quite a few number of Jews the idea that this is feasible. Now, I think most of the early Zionists knew exactly that there were other people there. If you read the diary of Theodor Herzl, if you read the early reports of the first Zionist settlers who came to Palestine, they say quite clearly, as one of them put it, that the bride is beautiful, but it's married to another man. But they also, at the same breath, saying, but we have the power to remove the people and make it a Jewish state. And I think that's the origins of this. So, no, and I will finish by saying, on the one hand, yes, of course, Jews who came to Palestine, quite a number of them were running away from anti-Semitism. And definitely, in the case of the Holocaust, were probably running away from extermination. But the fact that they thought that salvation means victimizing the Palestinian by colonizing it makes this connection immoral and irresponsible and unacceptable. So it's not a complex story in that way. It's a very tragic story. And I would just add that the Palestinians would have received the Jews as refugees. They would have received them as refugees. They could never receive them as colonizers.
Thank you. That was great. It's interesting that those very early roots of Christian Zionism don't come up very much in this narrative when we talk about the Nakba. We talk about Christian Zionism in current times, but not the effect it had that far back. That's very interesting. And you both made very clear the immorality of what was being planned, regardless of what the motivations were and the conditions in Europe that were catalyzing this. Well, another thing we heard in those clips was that the Palestinians were becoming aware during these years of heavy immigration from Europe of what the plan was, what Zionists were planning to do to immigrate in large enough numbers to eventually take over. And they therefore, I would say quite understandably, started to revolt against this plan, against the British and the immigrants that were in their midst. And the British successfully suppressed that revolt, but they also began to limit or completely cut off Jewish immigration. And that put them in direct conflict with the Zionist movement and with their militias. And you have, I think, some memory of that, Samia, your family's experience of that period when, before the partition plan, before the ethnic cleansing began in earnest, when the Zionists were fighting the British. I wonder if you could share that with us. And you are muted.
Well, I think the Jewish underground, they were terrorizing the British as well, because they wanted to get rid of them. Not only, they wanted to get rid of the mandate so that they will do what they wanted. And one of the very, very serious blasting was the offices of the administration of the British mandate, which was a wing of the King David Hotel. They bombed that and it killed around 100 people. They did it on a Saturday, so that the minimum of the Jewish employees would be there. And mostly they would be Palestinians and some British. I mean, they worked, some British worked on Saturdays. Whether it was by divine intervention or whether it was a miracle, I don't know. But my father was one of the 3 assistant secretaries to the British General Secretary at the time of the mandate. And he resigned. He resigned after 2 years of working in that post. He resigned because he could see the plan the British were planning to help the Jews get settled in Palestine. And he just couldn't take it anymore. And on that day, he was supposed to go and hand over to the person who took over after him, Atala Mantura. And after he reached the gate of the King David Hotel, he looked at his watch and he said, "It's a little bit early. I'm coming to have lunch at the YMCA across the street. I might as well go and see my friend Aizat Manous down the hill in Mamilla Road." He hardly reached Mamilla when the building blew up. I mean, we'll never forget that day. And that was really the beginning of our being terrorized and scared. And shortly after that, you know, the Christmas of the Greek Orthodox at the Semiramis Hotel, they got another bombing there. And also two families who were in charge of that hotel, they almost perished completely. And that was also a part of one of the reasons that the Katamon people were one of the first people to leave the area when things became very, very tense and serious. Of course, that was in the wake of the Dar Yassin massacre, which in 1948 was very, very, this was one of the first terrorizing incidents in our area, in the Jerusalem area. So many others took place, of course, in the Galilee, which Ilan has recorded in his, excuse me.
Well, let's turn to Ilan. Yeah. Can you tell us, Ilan, more about what was going on in this period and maybe pin down the years we're talking about also?
Yes, the period leading to 1948, I suppose that's what you were talking about with Samia, not so much 48 itself. I suppose we'll get there. Not much to add to what Samia said. I would just say an aspect that I think is quite often overlooked by those who are trying to understand the Palestinian resistance during 1918 to 1948, during the 30 years of British rule. The Palestinian elite, whatever we think about it, which was to begin with was a very Arab Ottoman elite that was moving into modern times, and during the 1920s and 1930s was slowly replaced by new middle class in the towns of Palestine with a bit of a different worldview, whoever they were, from the end of the First World War, when they were engaged with Britain, and many of them were pro-British, when they were engaged with Britain about the future of Palestine, they conveyed, and this is very well documented in the various inquiry commissions that visited Palestine and where Palestinians represented the Palestinian point of view. They conveyed very clearly that there are two principles that they are learning from the West, which seems to be very positive in their eyes. One principle is the principle of democracy. And the second principle is the principle of self-determination. They were very impressed by President Woodrow Wilson's ideas of self-determination and democracy. And when Wilson sent his two friends, Charles Crane and Henry King, in the famous King-Crane Committee in 1919 to find out what do the Palestinian wants, and we have all the documents. The Palestinian delegation told them what we would like to implement here in Palestine, the noble ideas of President Wilson. Namely, instead of being under an empire, such as the Ottoman Empire, we would like to be a nation with a state, a democratic one, that implements its right for self-determination. And this position was there all along the mandate. However, when these inquiry commissions met the Zionists, they heard something very different. The Zionists were against democracy in mandatory Palestine because obviously they were a small minority, and had there been democratic elections in Palestine during the mandate, the vast majority of people in Palestine would have voted for Palestine, not for an Israel, so to speak, right? And secondly, the Zionists said that the Palestinians don't have the right for self-determination because they are Arabs, and they can have a self-determination outside of Palestine. This was the declared position of the Zionist leaders. And you can see how Palestinians would feel betrayed throughout that period. I mean, here they are welcoming the West, not as imperialists, not as colonialists. They're saying, okay, you're bringing with you the message of self-determination, the message of democracy. We in Palestine are embracing it. And you are betraying us. You are betraying us. And this sense of betrayal is very powerful in the Palestinian resistance. It's not a nation, and Samia knows it. The Palestinians are not a nation of warriors. It's a very peaceful nation. Palestinians really like to live normal and very natural life. They're not crazy about confrontations and wars and so on. But they were really forced by the British, because one should add another aspect of these inquiry commissions. Each one of them, and there were about 5 of them, each one of them warned the British government that if it would allow unlimited Jewish immigration and unlimited Jewish purchase of land, it would be an existential danger to the Palestinians. These inquiry commissions warned the British government. And the British government heeded a bit too late with this when it started to limit. By the way, it never stopped it altogether. It limited the immigration, and the Zionists did an underground immigration. So quite a lot of Jews continued to arrive in Palestine. What they did succeed, although it was not so much their success, is to limit the purchase of land. But the purchase of land of the Zionists was limited not just because of the British policy, because somewhere in the 1930s, even the landlords who were selling land to the Jews understood the purpose of Zionism and stopped selling lands to the Jews. So the Zionist movement altogether got less than 6% of the Palestinian lands by 1948, which is one of the reasons they used force. So I think it's very important to understand the betrayal of the West and Britain in particular of both promises made to the Palestinians, but also of the principles of democracy and self-determination. And this, as you know, impacted the whole Arab world. It's not surprising that the Arab world never really put its trust in democracy, because for them, democracy was a method for the West to colonize and to use its own interest at the expense of the local people. Democracy doesn't have a high rating nowadays, and that's one of the reasons. American Orientalists like to say it's because that the Arabs can never be democratic. That was the old Orientalist idea, that Arabs cannot, eschew democracy. It's not true. It's just the message from the West was democracy is not for you, it's for anyone else. And I think that's a very important aspect I would like to highlight.
Mm-hmm. It's very helpful. That's another point that I don't think's ever been brought into this narrative. And it's still obviously true today that we say we're exporting democracy when we're trying to supposedly liberate nations in the Gulf. And clearly that is a propaganda talking point. There are other motives lying underneath. Thanks. All right, we are going to move on, and we're going to, for this next clip, I think I'm going to be asking for some very quick comments, and then we'll go to the one after that. But Bridget, right now, can we have clip number 3?
In the 1930s, the British had suppressed a revolt by Palestinian Arabs against the colonization of their homeland, and their own displacement from that land. In 1939, the British initiated a new policy to limit Jewish immigration to Palestine, to avoid exacerbating tensions in the region. In response to that policy, Zionist militias fought against the British and committed acts of terrorism that culminated in the 1946 bombing of the King David Hotel, in which 96 people were killed. By the late 1940s, the British made plans to leave Palestine, rather than deal with the turmoil created by their own colonial regime and their encouragement of Zionist colonization.
They brought the problem of Palestine to the United Nations in 1947, 2 years after that institution had been founded. A United Nations Special Committee recommended a plan to divide Palestine between the Zionists and the Palestinian Arabs. This plan was promoted without regard for the wishes of the great majority of the population, the indigenous people of the land, the Palestinians, who did not want their land divided. Through massive Zionist immigration efforts in the first half of the 20th century, the Jewish population in Palestine had increased dramatically, from about 6% at the turn of the century to 33% in 1947. Jews owned less than 7% of the land. In 1947, the indigenous Palestinians equaled 67%, 2/3 of the population of Palestine. Nevertheless, the UN partition plan would give the majority of the land, 56% of Palestine, to the Zionists, who were just 1/3 of the population. Indeed, Jews were not even a majority in that area that was proposed for the new state. Notably, that area included most of the land suitable for agriculture. It was a shocking proposal for Palestinians, and for Arabs throughout the region. The UN partition plan reflected the desire of world leaders to help the Jewish people after the terrible crime of the Holocaust, the genocide of 6 million Jews in Europe during World War II. Zionist organizers were lobbying government leaders intensely in Europe and the United States. President Harry Truman responded by supporting the UN partition plan, and authorized US diplomats to pressure other nations to get their votes at the UN. The plan was adopted by the UN General Assembly on November 29, 1947. There were joyful celebrations by Zionists in Palestine and in Jewish communities around the world. For the Palestinian people, this was a terrible step toward the loss of their homeland and the negation of their right to self-determination. The United Nations, dominated by colonialist world powers, had acted in violation of its founding principles.
All right. Well, that's certainly a huge subject to talk about. But again, I'm going to encourage us to do this one briefly because we have some other very big topics about the Nakba to cover. So your thoughts about the UN partition plan. What do we need to know about it? I'm going to ask Samia again first. From your perspective as a Palestinian, what did this mean for the Palestinian people? What did this mean for you personally, for your family? You're muted.
We never accepted that because it was not fair. I mean, we're the owners. I remember my father commented at that time. It's quoting the sage King Solomon saying, you know, that the owner of the real owner of the child didn't want her son to be partitioned, divided, you know, between the woman who was claiming it's her son. And because we felt this is our land. I mean, we've always lived here, and Jews were living also with us. I remember our neighbors in Safed, where we had Jewish neighbors, I mean, and they were Palestinians, and they were part of the, well, of course, we didn't realize how much scheming was taking place at the time, but unfortunately, you know, this generation of our children now, they have never encountered a Jewish person except as an Israeli soldier who's harassing him and occupying him and so on. But back to the injustice of the partition in the first place, because of course we felt sorry for what was happening to the Jews in Germany, but that was no solution to deprive us of our country and to deprive us of our rights as the legal owners. Over and above, I mean, the injustice of the partition, even when we're such a minority, took over 56% of the land, and the original people were taking 42%. It is basically the basic justice of the idea of partitioning the land to start with and how they partitioned it. And so it was not acceptable. And of course, everybody said, you created the refugee problem by your own will, the Palestinians. We were blamed that we created the refugee problem. Had you accepted the partition, it would have been all right. We know very well that the Jews were not, they were accepting the partition because they had further plans to take over the whole of land. And it was very, very clear, and it's documented, that we will accept now, and then later on we will take over the whole rest of the Palestine.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, wonderful. Ilan, your thoughts about what the UN did at this time, and maybe just a thought or two that I will throw in there, that what a young institution it was and how inexperienced they were.
Yeah, definitely. The United Nations was, the two things about the United Nations. One, it was a young organization, and probably the question of Palestine was the first serious question it had to deal with. Secondly, it did not represent most of the world. I mean, most of the world was still colonized. And most of the nation states of the 50s and the 60s were not yet nation states because they were under colonial rule. So it was really the Western consensus about Palestine. And as I noted before, the Western consensus was that Palestine should be the solution for the Jewish problem of the West, rather than the Jewish problem in the West should be solved in the West. So the Palestinians had very little chance of putting forward their position. Again, we should remember the Palestinian counter position was, like in Egypt, like in Iraq, like anywhere else in the world, the majority of the people of Palestine would decide the future of their homeland. And this was denied to them, and they had to to petition their homeland, and even ask to give a larger section of their homeland with most of the natural resources to a movement of settlers. Most of them arrived 2-3 years before the petition. I mean, any person in the world with a modicum of decency in them would have rejected such an idea. And the Palestinians also compared it later on, and rightly so, to North Africa. They said, would you expected the Algerians to give half of Algeria to the French settlers, who, by the way, were much longer in Algeria than the Zionist settlers were in Palestine? So as Walid Khalidi used to say, there was nothing moral, nothing just, nothing pragmatic in that resolution. It was really an anti-Palestinian resolution that was meant to help the Zionist movement to colonize Palestine, and one can fully understand the Palestinian rejection to it. I would just add one thing, that the United Nations made a terrible mistake which it realized a bit too late later, and even the Americans realized it, by saying that if the Palestinians don't accept this resolution, we will force it upon them, which is really ridiculous and outrageous in many ways, because, the Palestinians, and later, as I say, some United Nations member states, and definitely the American State Department, said, okay, if the Palestinians don't accept it, we have to continue and talk about the future. We cannot impose it on the Palestinians. And that was a terrible mistake. The United Nations carries huge responsibility for the disaster of the Palestinians, not just by the petition resolution itself, but by the decision to impose it on the Palestinians.
Thank you. Yes. That's a wonderful and very helpful summary of what they did and what was wrong with what they did. Not only the plan, but the intention to impose it, which they had no authority or moral right to do, and making that point of the size of the institution, and the very few nations that were able to be members of it at that time. We're still talking about events that precede 1948. But at this time, this is where the serious plans to begin the ethnic cleansing of Palestine would get started, with this partition plan as an excuse and a motivation to begin to appropriate the land. So we are going to begin now to hear about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in action, perhaps the most foundational aspect of it, which is Plan Dalit. And Bridget, can you play for us clip number 4?
May 15th of 1948 was the date that the British would complete their evacuation of Palestine. Zionist leaders prepared to take over the land they intended to have for a Jewish state. Those preparations included Plan Dalit, or Plan D, which laid out a strategy for the Zionist militia. Not all historians agree about the intentions behind Plan Dalit. To strengthen the security of the soon-to-be-created Jewish state, or to implement the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous Palestinians. But the orders that accompanied Plan Dalit make clear the goal of the plan. These orders that were marked as secret used the Hebrew words for to cleanse, and to destroy, and to expel. The orders for Plan D included the destruction of villages and the forced expulsion of entire village populations to move them outside the planned borders of the future state.
Okay, there it is. Maybe the core issue when we talk about the Nakba, the fact that the ethnic cleansing was in fact planned, quite intentional, very systematic. I have to say, I'm surprised that there could be any disagreement about it, that an historian like Benny Morris, another one of the so-called new historians of Israel, given all the material that we just saw in that short clip and all the material that he and you uncovered, could ever propose that Plan Dalit or Dalit was simply for the defense of the borders of the country, come an attack from other nations. So maybe you could address that, Ilan, for us, and expand on the what you know about this plan.
Yeah. First of all, the position of Benny Morris or Israeli historians who kind of reject the idea that Plan Dalit had anything to do with the expulsion, as I explained in the clip, they decide not to mention what was called the Situation D, or Matzav Dalit in Hebrew, which was a group of orders emanating from Plan D that showed the direct connection between Plan D and massive ethnic cleansing of Palestine. It's not, and I think it's very important to see the picture in its entirety rather than kind of analyze a document and see how it works. Anyone who is familiar with ethnic cleansing cases in history knows that you cannot just take one document as a kind of smoking gun document and by only through that document decide whether there was a master plan to dispossess a whole nation. You can't even do it for the Holocaust in terms of genocide or anywhere else in the world where there was genocide or the genocide of the Africans who became slaves. There is no master document who says we will eliminate millions of Africans. I think what is important is the whole context, and the context is that in March 1948, the Zionist leadership understands that the British mandate is over, that they have only 6% of the land, and they're not the majority of the land. They're not even the majority, or they're hardly the majority, even in the state that was offered to them by the United Nations. And the main worry of the Zionist leadership was the Palestinian elite in the cities and the towns. Under the noses of the British, when Britain was still responsible for law and order, in April, from mid-April 1948 to the very beginning in May 1948, within 3 weeks, the Zionist forces ethnically cleansed most of Palestine's towns, the Palestinian towns, or most of the Palestinians who lived in towns. Some were pure Palestinian towns, some were mixed towns. So within 3 weeks, under the orders that came from Plan D, the population of Jaffa was expelled, the population of Haifa was expelled, of Baisan, of Safad, of Acre, of Tiberias. It happens about 3 weeks after Plan D. I mean, you really have to be historically blind, not to see, ideologically blind, actually, not to see the connection. Now, of course, I don't believe that they think that way. I'm sorry to say this. I don't think Benny Morris believes half of what he says. It's a very opportunistic point of view. He says it because he didn't enjoy, and I understand it because I was in his position. It's not nice to be treated as a traitor by your own community. I know it. So he decided that this is the best way of getting the warm embrace. But he's not the top. He's not the issue. The issue is really the fact that you have here a political and military leadership that understands very well three things. One, that the Palestinians don't possess the military power to prevent their ethnic cleansing. That's one thing. The second thing, they understand that the Arab world would first of all respect the mandate, would not send troops before the end of the mandate. And even when it would send troops, and they knew about it, it had its own wars of liberation to fight and its own interest. And therefore, there was no chance that the Arab world would use its real might to save the Palestinians. That's the second thing that the Zionist leadership understood. And the third thing that they realized was that the world, few years after the Holocaust, would watch the ethnic cleansing of Palestine with the massacres that were part of it, and would say it's a small injustice to correct a large injustice. Mm. They write about it like this, the Zionist leaders. They knew exactly that this was the situation. They were not at all surprised by their success. In fact, they were disappointed that they only managed to expel half of the Palestinians and not all the villages. And the reason was that there was Palestinian resistance, there was Palestinian resilience, and they themselves didn't have the capacity to complete the ethnic cleansing, which they will try later on to complete by other means.
Yes, thank you. And that makes the point that so much of what they did was by no means a response to any attack on Israel. This was, in fact, as you pointed out, immediately after Plan Dalet was initiated. And in fact, the Arab nations, when they finally did get involved militarily, and as you said, they waited until the British mandate officially ended, the middle of May. They didn't bring their full force by any means.
If I may add something, Theresa, because I think that's very important. The most important bit of the Israeli propaganda, which unfortunately some even of Palestine friends accept, is that the Arab world started a war against Israel, and the Palestinians became victims of this war. Mm-hmm. This is not the chronology. The chronology is Israel expels nearly 250,000 Palestinians. The Arab public pressures the government to do something about it. And when they do, it's too late and too little. This is the chronology. It's amazing how American television, British television, history books in America and all over the West teach the Israeli chronology, which is the fabrication of truth, namely that nothing happened until the 15th of May. The Arab world enters Israel, they would call it invade Israel, and therefore, unfortunately, the Palestinians became victims of that war. This is one of the biggest success of the Israeli propaganda, which we have to refute because we have the facts on our side.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you for making that clear. Samia, is it all right if I move to the next clip, or do you have something you'd like to add to that? Oh, you're muted again. I think you're saying it's okay. I thought I saw you nodding your head.
Yeah. I just want to add that history is usually written by powerful people and by the victorious. I mean,
that's right. Exactly right.
There are so many lies in that.
What in a way is remarkable is that things have changed just enough that we are starting to change the narrative. with events like this, with the fact that the UN now officially commemorates the Nakba, for which they had so much responsibility.
Well, it's
Yeah.
high time after 75 years.
Exactly, I know. Too little, too late.
I don't
But
know if they can
hopefully,
do
we can,
much about other
I'm
than
hoping we can-
recognize.
sorry.
I said it's not enough to recognize it. They have to do something about it.
Right, right, exactly.
Yeah, but I doubt that they will.
Well, we're going to move now to some details about how this ethnic cleansing was accomplished. Clip number 5 about the Deir Yassin massacre.
On April 9, 1948, one of the most infamous events of the Nakba occurred. The massacre in the Palestinian village of Deir Yassin. This village had signed a peace agreement with a neighboring Jewish village, and all of the residents were just civilians. Between 110 to 140 Palestinians were killed, most of them women, children, and the elderly. Hand grenades were thrown into homes indiscriminately, bodies were stuffed down wells or were mutilated. One survivor describes a horrific scene of a child thrown into an oven in front of his father, and the father put in the oven after him. After the massacre, the survivors were transported in trucks through the streets of Jerusalem where they were mocked, spit upon, and stoned by residents. The news of what had happened at Deir Yassin spread throughout every Palestinian village and town. This was not the only massacre committed, but it was the most widely reported. It was one of 24 massacres committed by Zionist forces. Historians report that by far the most massacres and atrocities were committed by Zionists during this war. The Deir Yassin massacre and other such actions terrified many thousands of Palestinians, as was intended, convincing them to flee for their lives. Thus they became refugees, without realizing they would never be allowed to return home. Within a year, the village of Deir Yassin had been taken over by Jewish immigrants and its name was erased from maps.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Bridget. Well, we heard a lot there about the tactics that were being used to terrorize the population and murder them, but using murders and other tactics to terrorize a much larger number to flee. Samia, how does this compare to your experience of what you saw during this period? Ethnic cleansing that was done elsewhere or that you heard about, such as the massacre at Deir Yassin?
I was still a student at Birzeit. It was still a high school before it developed into university. And we had the headquarters of Abdul Qadir Husseini in Birzeit. And we were, as girls, we were knitting sweaters for their men. They were squatting under the trees, taking refuge. It was rather cool in April, you know, it was still cool. And all of a sudden, we heard that Abdul Qadir was killed in the Qastal battle around Jerusalem. And while everybody was mostly, all the men were at the funeral of Abdul Qadir Husseini, the next day, the Deir Yassin massacre took place. And it scared everybody. It scared everybody. And the Jewish militias were put in, they took few women and put them on trucks and went around all the neighbors of the Jerusalem, where the Palestinians' home were, you know, Upper Baqa, Lower Baqa, Qatamon, and all these areas, saying, if you don't leave now the same thing will happen to you as Deir Yassin. So everybody was so scared. They didn't even have time to pack anything. Whatever they had in front of them, they just packed and left. We were in Birzeit, and 3 of my aunts who were living in Jerusalem, 2 my maternal aunts and a paternal aunt and a cousin of my father who was at the YMCA, was working at the YMCA, they all came to Birzeit. And of course, at that time, tension has mounted, and my father advised my aunt Nabiha, who was the school principal, to let the school come to an end so that its children will not be stuck. Many of them came from the rest of Palestine, from Haifa, Jaffa, Nazareth, all these areas. So we had enough room in the dorms and empty space to host all these cousins and aunts and with their children. And it was really, everybody was so tense and scared. But then everybody was saying, oh, it's just a matter of 2 weeks and we will go back. Even I remember one of my uncles who had a lot of sense of humor. He kept saying, we're coming for a picnic for 2 weeks, you know. And he kept saying afterwards, the picnic took much longer than 2 weeks, you know. And eventually he was the one who started the vocational school for the YMCA in Jericho, because we had lots of refugees in Berzeit who ended up there afterwards, after the, we'll talk about that later, maybe after the Lidda and Ramleh exodus.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ilan, your thoughts about this history and how these tactics were being used?
Yes. The Plan D itself, the master plan, but also the commands were very clear about a few things. One is that it's better to force the people to flee than to expel them by force if possible. But if it's impossible to force them to flee, then one should expel them directly. And for that reason, usually the Zionist forces, later on Israeli forces, used to flank villages from 3 sides and leave one flank open so that people could escape. But sometimes they didn't kind of heed this idea, and they found themselves surrounding the villages without any chance of people to escape, and this is mostly when massacres happened. But the idea was actually not to bother too much with the reaction of the population. If it doesn't immediately evict the neighborhood or the village, they should be forced to do so. The second thing that both the plan and the commands show is that the villages and the neighborhoods were not treated as civilian spaces. They were treated as military bases, or rather as terrorist bases. So there's one chilling example. What happens when this is the perception. In April, the intelligence section of the Israeli forces had to clarify to the soldiers an earlier command that said, in every village and neighborhood, you should gather the men and find out who was a member of a gang and so on, and execute them, and the rest should be arrested. And the units wanted a clarification. What do you mean by man? Who is a man? And the chilling answer was anyone above the age of 10. And therefore we see scenes before May 48 and after 1948 of the separation, of the selection. Women and children are putting on one side, men are being put to the other side. And then the men, the women and children are being expelled. The men, some of them would be executed, and many of them would be sent into prisoner camps. And we owe it to the great scholar Salman Abu Sitta, who just only a few years ago was able to find out the International Red Cross documentation of these prison camps. So many Palestinian men who spend there a year, sometimes a year and a half before being allowed to come back. So the method was, as in every ethnic cleansing, was not genocidal in the sense that the idea was not to kill as many Palestinians as possible, but to expel as many Palestinians as possible. But if you are expelling millions of people, you are unavoidably, you are also dehumanizing them to the extent that if you need to kill them, you do it without any hesitation. And one should say, of course, it is true that the Israeli forces used to threaten villages, that what happened in Deir Yassin would happen to them. But one should say, Deir Yassin was the beginning of a series of about 40 massacres. So it was not just Deir Yassin that made people in Palestine think twice whether they should stay when the Israelis are coming. There were other massacres on the way, as horrendous as Deir Yassin, that created this fear among people that if they stay in their villages, they would be exposed to a similar fate. And finally, I would add to this that the biggest shock, I think, and this I know from the oral history I and many others have conducted, the Palestinians were used in their history to being occupied or by being ruled by different authorities. There were the Ottomans, then came the British, and some of them naively said, okay, now, the Israelis would be the rulers. And the first thing that the new ruler is doing is telling them to evict their villages or neighborhoods. And this was a great shock to them. And they were not a military unit. These were villages. And they were really no chance against the Israeli determination to ethnically cleanse them. It's quite surprising how such a crime against humanity that was known to so many people in the world was never fully condemned and acknowledged only now, 75 years later. But I think we are all aware of that.
Yeah, it's true. It is extraordinary that it has taken this long for the world to name honestly what was done then, to begin to at least. But I at least do have hope that we are beginning to change the narrative. It is one of the extraordinary things of this history, though, that back then, the Zionist movement and the Israelis were so successful in getting away with the crimes they were committing in full view of the world. All right, I'm going to skip through some clips a couple of short ones we were going to do and just state what they cover. As we've said, we've been talking about events that precede the end of the British Mandate and the actual declaration of the Israeli state. So the British did finish their evacuation and ended their mandate May 14th and May 15th. The declaration came by Ben-Gurion to the world, declaring that the Israeli state had been created. And in the video, we see celebrating similar to what accompanied the announcement of the UN partition plan, but even on a larger scale. Celebrating by Jews in Israel and in other parts of the world. And with that, the attacks on Palestinian cities and towns continued, but an enormous amount had been accomplished already at that point. And soon after that, there was a short truce that had been declared in July of 48. And as soon as that ended, Israelis targeted the towns of Ramli and Lida. There is another video that we're not going to have time for about Operation Danny, which was targeting Ramli and Lida. But and it is similar to what we've already been hearing about in videos and from our speakers was being done in these other cities and towns. But Sammy, I think you have some specific memories of the refugees from those communities, Ramli and Lida. If you could share those with us, that would be great.
That memory is still etched in my head, and I'll never forget this trauma So I can imagine what these people went through. I was reading, it was summer in the hot months of July, and I was sitting on the veranda and reading. And then all of a sudden we saw these droves of people walking, and I ran downstairs to see what's happening. And it turned out that the people of Ramle and Ridda were evicted at gunpoint, and they were ripped off of their finances and whatever they could carry, money and jewelry. I mean, they were not allowed to carry anything. So they took their, at least these possessions, and they thought they could survive on them for a while. They lost things. And it was, you can imagine what it meant for whole families with children walking all this distance from Ramle to Berzeit, and then some of them went on to Ramallah. But the bulk of them were in that area. And of course, when everybody saw this, my aunt, who was the principal of the school, she said, get out everything in the storeroom, you know, and let's just feed these people. They haven't eaten anything for the last 2-3 days as they walked their way. We got out. I'll never forget the number of potatoes and eggs that we boiled, the number of tomatoes and cucumbers that we chopped that day and bringing out, you know, preserved in and in the school we had so much preserved the cheese and Lebanese and oil and all that. We put everything out for them. And some of we hosted some also in one of the boys' schools, which was already empty in them, and the mosque opened their doors and the churches opened their doors and hosted a lot of them at the time. And it was so sad. It was so sad. We went, the Red Cross sent a nurse to help. And we'd go under the trees. That most of them stayed under the trees. It was in July and it was warm enough, but it was very hot, of course, at the same time to sit under the trees. And we'd go and help her and check on children mostly. I mean, the children were in a very, very bad situation. It was so sad. I'll never forget that day. It was a memorable day in the history of our people. And with all these refugees, then my father decided, he said, we should document all these information. And it was the first census that was done actually for any Palestinian refugees. So he got us, all of us, the young people of the town and the family, as volunteers to do this job. And we went around and recording where everybody came from, how many children they had, and which villages, because along Ramle and Ridda, many villages joined, of course, the escape. And the Red Cross even recognized that important work, and he was cited a merit for that, and appreciation for what he did. And actually, these documents were the first documents that were handed into the UNRWA when they took over after the Red Cross, and they were the first documents for refugees. And later on, as I was telling you, this uncle of mine, many of these refugees ended up in Jericho. And he started a vocational school for the YMCA in Jericho, which is still, I think, running up to this day, the vocational school in Jericho for the refugees in the Nakba Jabir camp, which is one of the largest camps in, and actually the YWCA, the World YWCA, was one of the first organizations that came to work at the YWCA at the refugee camp as to relieve the people and teach them some skills to do so that they can work and earn a living. It was a real catastrophe, This
It's so valuable to have someone with us who can tell us from a personal perspective that it really happened. This isn't just something written down on paper or in a movie. This is your life and the life of millions of others.
I know I didn't experience running away because we were already in school, but witnessing this will never make me forget that incident at all.
Ilan, I'm going to skip ahead to another video because this is a great segue to our clip number 9, which is about the refugees. Truly one of the core issues of the entire conflict, one that the conflict will never be resolved. There will never be peace in Israel and Palestine until the issue of the Palestinian refugees is resolved, and justly. And Bridget, can you play for us clip number 9?
After the declaration of the State of Israel, and in response to the crisis that had been created for Palestinians, Arab states intervened militarily on behalf of the Palestinians. Warfare broke out between Israel and its neighbors in May of 1948. Equipped militarily by Western powers that backed the Zionist movement, Israeli forces had largely overcome Arab armies by the fall. Israel focused again on removing Palestinians, now from the Galilee region in the north and the Negev desert in the south. An Israeli veteran, Hava Keller, has described clearing out the Palestinians of Beersheba and sending them to Gaza, where they and their descendants remain as refugees today. As Palestinian survivors of the Nakba recall, they did not imagine that they were being expelled from their homes and their land permanently. Refugees were a temporary condition of war, and it is expected, when the war is over, the refugees can return home. Why would it be any different for the Palestinians in 1948? The steadfast intention of Palestinians to return to their homeland is manifested in the keys to their homes that they have preserved, and which have become a symbol of the refugees' right of return. However, as was seen in Plan Dalet, the existence of all these refugees was not the usual consequence of war, it was planned. Included in that plan was the intention that these refugees could not be allowed to return. Israeli veteran Yuri Avneri describes the orders they had: to shoot every Arab who we saw coming back. Operational Order Number 40. Expel the Arab refugees from the villages and prevent them from returning again by destroying the villages. Sweep the villages, gather their inhabitants, load them on vehicles and expel them to Gaza. Check the refugees' travel routes and mine those roads. One justification for these war crimes was that Palestinians would constitute a fifth column of subversives if they were allowed to return to their homes within what was now declared to be Israel. Another rationalization, much closer to reality, was that the refugees must be permanently exiled so that Israel could have a Jewish majority population. The nationalist goal of the Zionist movement outweighed the human rights of these refugees, universal rights under international law. The Geneva Conventions, to which Israel is a signatory, provide for refugees' right to return to their homes following the cessation of fighting. In the territory that became Israel, there had existed 500 to 700 Palestinian villages. When the war was over, all but about 100 of those Palestinian villages had been emptied of Palestinians. Hundreds of villages were destroyed and many others were taken over by Jewish immigrants with all traces of their Palestinian history erased. In many places, cactus has been planted to mark the locations of destroyed Palestinian homes and villages. 700 to 800,000 Palestinians had fled the violence of the Nakba. That was about 80% of the Palestinians living in the area that became Israel. The Israeli government claimed it had no responsibility for these refugees having left. Many Israelis and Zionist supporters still make this claim today. However, Israel's own records from that period, uncovered and published by Israel's new historians, have clearly shown the Zionists' responsibility for the Nakba. This evidence shows that the Palestinians were displaced by various types of force, including at gunpoint and through the terror incurred by massacres and atrocities. Most significantly, this displacement was done with the intention of never allowing these refugees to return home. Some Israeli veterans and historians have stated explicitly that all of this was necessary in order for Israel to exist. According to them and many other witnesses and historians, the State of Israel, as it was planned, could not have come into existence without these crimes being committed against the Palestinian people.
Okay. That I think reinforces a lot of what we've talked about, that clearly this was an intentional plan to ethnically cleanse the land, to change the demographics so that there would be a Jewish majority for this state that was being created, and to never let them come back. There's two aspects of it I think we haven't covered, and we're going to need to address them really quickly. And I will let our audience know that clearly we are going past our time. We're going to try to wrap this up in the next, I would say, 5 to 10 minutes. So for both of our speakers, that gives you 1 or 2 minutes to address this subject, and then we still have one more thing to talk about. So the question I have is, in terms of the ramifications on the broader picture, the international ramifications of making such a decision that they can refuse to ever let the refugees return. What does that mean, do you think, today? How does this need to be addressed? And then I have a follow-up question for you. Either of you that would like to jump in, that would be fine. Go ahead, Ilan.
Okay. It's important to understand that the United Nations already in the end of on the 11th of December 1948 passed a resolution 194 that recognized the right of the Palestinian refugees to return, not as a political act, but just as a commonsensical humanitarian act, so that people after fighting are entitled to go back to their homes. And in fact, even the American State Department supported that resolution, and the resolution was reaffirmed year after year with American support roughly until the early 1970s. So the international community, on the one hand, never doubted the right of the Palestinian refugees to return, and never accepted the Israeli explanation why they do not allow the refugees to return. But the international community didn't do anything to force Israel to change a position that, according to international law and according to the Convention of Refugees, was a violation of these convention and law. That was a very important message to the Israelis that would impact their behavior later on in other aspects. It's very clear that whoever talks the talk will never walk the walk when it comes to Israel. And Israelis to this very day believe that this is really the situation. So they're never worried about what people are saying or whether they are violating international law, because they know that nobody will take action against them. So I think that's one aspect of this Israeli policy of not allowing the refugees to return. But I think there is a more profound aspect for this. And this is something that is not being talked about enough. The main reason Israel did not allow the Palestinian refugees to return is racism. It's racism. It's pure racism. This very decision not to allow the refugees to return shows that the West is calling a racist state the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel is based on a deep, Americans should recognize it. Americans know what racism is. This is a deep racism. The problem is that after the Holocaust, people are not allowed to talk about Jewish racism. You can talk about Christian racism, you can talk about Muslim racism, but you're not allowed to say that the Jewish state is racist. It's like Holocaust denier, definitely anti-Semitism. But this is the heart of the issue. There is no other explanation apart from racism not to allowing the Palestinians to return. I mean, even the kind of dry way in which Benny Morris says, well, the Israeli government thought it's not good that there will be a demographic change when they come back. It was not a demographic change. This was the reality that Israel by force changed. It was not, these were not Palestinians who voluntarily immigrated to other countries and then had second thoughts. These were victims of expulsions. And you cannot kind of disconnect the crime of expulsion from the crime of not allowing repatriation. But again, like the whole message from the international community about the destruction of villages, about the massacres, and about not allowing the refugees, the whole message to the state of Israel was not only that you will not be condemned for doing that, we will still regard you as the only democracy in that region. That is something that the whole region is suffering from, this hypocrisy and double talk and exceptionalism. I do hope that there are signs that might change with the help of the current Israeli governments, who really pose a real challenge to anybody who's saying about this or talking about Israel as a democratic state nowadays. But it was always the issue. It didn't start this year. It was always the issue.
Thank you so much for naming the racism that is behind all of this. In fact, the very desire to create an ethnically homogeneous society, a Jewish society. The basis of that is racial preference. And of course, that was learned in Europe from those who were oppressing the Jews. So they carried that idea with them and wanted to perpetuate it for themselves. And Samia, I forgive me, but I'm going to jump to the last video, and I will definitely give you the first chance to respond to that.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry, I just want to comment on the not being allowed to go back. I want to say that even those who were evicted from their homes, in the people who were living in Haifa and ended up in Nazareth, they could not go back to their homes in Haifa. I mean, this is also inside Israel itself. They could not go back to their homes, which is, I think, also
internally
just very important point.
Yeah, that is. So they still didn't ever get to go back to home.
So,
yeah. Thank you. That's very good. All right. We're going to go to, there's a video we're going to skip talking about the destruction of villages, which was another important part of not allowing the refugees to return, either planting over them completely and trying to remove any trace of them, or take them and turn them into Jewish communities without any trace of their Arab culture. And this happened with hundreds of villages, 400 to 500 villages that existed in what became Israel. This was done, an enormous cultural genocide, as we call it, and a practical measure to make it virtually impossible for the refugees to find anything to return to. And now I'd like to go, Bridget, if we can, to our last clip, number 11.
The war ended in 1949, and the State of Israel then covered 78% of historic Palestine, more than 3/4 of that land. Far worse than the unjust proposal of 56% in the UN partition plan. Only some land on the west bank of the Jordan River that included East Jerusalem, and a small piece of land on the Mediterranean, the Gaza Strip, 22% of historic Palestine, remained for Palestinians. The United Nations officially recognized the new state in 1949, and the United States had done that the year before. A big part of the Zionist dream was realized: the successful establishment of the State of Israel. As we have seen, it was a dream predicated upon and accomplished through the destruction of a society and the ethnic cleansing of an indigenous people from their homeland. Another part of the dream, creating a sanctuary of safety for the Jewish people, was not realized then, and it has not been achieved since that time. Contrary to popular perceptions, the essential issue of injustice in Palestine is not complicated to understand, and it is still at the heart of the conflict today. However, some important aspects of the conflict have changed. Over the 75 years since the Nakba, conditions on the ground have worsened greatly for Palestinians. In 1967, Israel started a preemptive war. As a result, it took military control of the last pieces of land left to Palestinians, the West Bank and Gaza. Since 2007, Gaza has been subjected to a devastating blockade and siege, and it is often called the world's largest open-air prison. 2 million Palestinians are trapped in the Gaza Strip due to the blockade and struggling to survive under conditions that the United Nations has described as unlivable. Also due to the blockade, 90% of Gaza's water is unfit for human consumption. Homes in Gaza often have electricity for only a few hours a day. And Gaza is only permitted such meager food supplies. Over 80% of the population depends on humanitarian aid for survival. In the West Bank, Israel has colonized so much of the land for settlements and Israeli-only roads that very little remains for a Palestinian state, supposedly the agreed goal throughout decades of negotiations in the peace process. Since 1967, the Israeli occupation has been responsible for the demolition of tens of thousands of Palestinian homes and entire villages, and the destruction of over 1 million olive trees. Hundreds of checkpoints across the West Bank make any semblance of a normal life impossible for Palestinians, who are cut off from jobs, schools, hospitals, and family. An enormous wall has confiscated significant portions of the occupied West Bank and annexed that land to Israel. This same wall surrounds the city of Bethlehem. Many Palestinians live with severe water deprivation in the West Bank. They either have no running water at home or have their water turned off for days or weeks at a time. Their Israeli neighbors in the segregated settlements have unlimited water throughout the year for swimming pools, gardens, and anything they would like. The Israeli settlers attack their Palestinian neighbors on a weekly or even daily basis, burning crops and animals, attacking homes and places of worship, and beating and shooting Palestinians. All of this is done with complete impunity, even with the protection of the Israeli army. In 2023, the world was shocked by reports of a terrifying and massive settler attack on the Palestinian town of Hawara, which was described even by Israelis as a pogrom, the name for the organized mob attacks against Jews in 19th century Europe. Palestinian children are harassed and arrested by Israeli military throughout the year. Hundreds of kids each year are subjected to notoriously unjust Israeli military courts and sent to Israeli prisons, almost always for the crime of throwing stones. The many facets of oppression of Palestinians have been widely documented by Israeli and international human rights organizations. They have concluded that Israel is a settler colonialist state and it has established an apartheid regime. But world powers for the most part have chosen to ignore that reality and to accept Israeli explanations and denials regarding their policies and actions. Political realities in that region, in the US, and around the world have obstructed all attempts at a just resolution. When we cut through the seemingly complicated details about Palestine and Israel, and focus on essentials, we can learn a great deal from the events surrounding Israel's founding, the Nakba, and discover what is at the root of this crisis. Knowing the Nakba brings us ultimately to some pivotal questions that have been posed by Professor Farid Abdel-Nour, chair of the Political Science Department at San Diego State University.
Was the establishment of the State of Israel so important that, no matter what price Palestinians had to pay for it, it was worth it? Or Was there something fundamentally wrong with a project that could only be realized by displacing hundreds of thousands of people? If the establishment of the State of Israel was a historic wrong, then the question now arises, how does one redress this wrong?
Okay. I'd like to ask for your final thoughts about what we've covered about the aftermath of the Nakba, and a particular thing that was said briefly in one of the clips, that they had no choice but to do this way, the Zionists did. It was us or them. If we had not succeeded, we could not be here. I'm wondering if you think that's true, if there was another way to go about this, another vision that the Zionists could have had, and what is your vision for what needs to happen now to address this wrong? Samia, I'll ask you.
I don't really know. It takes a prophet maybe to think what can happen with, we see how impotent the United Nations has been. The redressing of the grave injustice should have taken place many, many years ago. Every year, the same resolutions are taken, the right of return of refugees, even after 67. The return of all the occupied territories by force was inadmissible and should be returned to the Palestinians, and nothing is taken. Every day the violations take place in the West Bank, now in the occupied territories, and all we hear are the Europeans and the Americans saying it is not conducive to peace, it does not help a two-state solution. There is nothing that can be achieved by words. They have to take action. Nobody tries to even impose sanctions on Israel. Nobody dares even. I mean, the next day after Russia attacked Ukraine, the whole world was up in arms, imposing sanctions on Russia. And we haven't heard one word against what is happening from the international community or from those who really tip the balance in the United Nations, the Security Council and all these resolutions. They have not been able to achieve anything. And of course, it's always the anti-Semitism and the worry of being labeled anti-Semitic, makes people halt a bit and so on. This is so unfair, so unfair. I don't know. Tell you the truth, I don't know whether it will be possible.
Okay.
Although any injustice will always be the source of problems for the region until the injustice is redressed. But it certainly will not be taking place in my lifetime. I'll be 90 very soon, and I'm not sure I will see that day. Maybe the young people.
I understand. It's very discouraging. I think on the ground there, we can't imagine how discouraging it is to hear and see what the governments of the world are doing. I know that I speak for thousands, if not millions, in this movement for Palestinian liberation, that we won't give up and we will continue to stand with you. And it's perhaps a luxury that we have on this side of the Atlantic where I am in the US, that we do take hope in the small signs of change that we're seeing. Bills being introduced to Congress for Palestinian rights with at least a few dozen supporters, whereas 5-10 years ago, no such bill would have existed, let alone had a single supporter.
Right.
So, and the bill in question, the new one, HR 3103, we don't call it sanctions, but it would withhold aid to Israel based on human rights violations, so a form of sanctions. So it's still a long way coming. I know it's too slow, it's too little, but we will continue to stand with you and to push and to push and to push until we succeed. Ilan, can I ask for your final thoughts on
Yeah, in a sentence, because I have to move to another webinar. I'm sorry.
Yes,
It's
exactly.
quarter to, and as I told you,
Yes, this is your time
it
to
really
go.
went, which is good. No, I just took two short sentences, then I would leave you. I do apologize. I have another webinar. The first thought is that there was an option. Of course, there was another option. The United Nations even suggested almost with a majority, the idea of having a unitary state in 1947. The Jews were 20% of the population. The Palestinians were willing to have them in a post-colonial Palestine, give them basic right, all the rights, and create a country which was Palestinian with a Jewish minority in it. This is 48. There was no danger for the Jews of Europe anymore. And of course, there was a possibility, and even one small group called Brit Shalom, the Peace Alliance, suggested it, and Palestinians were willing to discuss it. As for the future, we are in a different position now. We are in existential danger for the Palestinian people from the present or the last few Israeli governments. They are using incremental genocide, ethnic cleansing. There is an urgency for the world to intervene. The Palestinians cannot stop it by themselves. And the world should by now, 75 years on, understand not what only happened in 1948, but should also respond to what goes on today. And this is as bad as 1948, what goes on today. So we can only hope to make sure that what so many people in civil society understand finally would influence governments, not only in the West, but all over the world, because the Palestinians would need international aid to stop the continued destruction of Palestine and the Palestinians. And I do apologize that I'm leaving you, but there's a large group of people from somewhere else in the world waiting for me.
So who need to hear from you.
I will leave you here, and thank you so much for having me. And this was a great webinar, and thank you all for your work. And it was lovely seeing you, Samia, and good health and long. We need you. We need you in the next 50 years. So don't give up.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hope is always, I mean, my target is hope. I mean,
yeah, we should always
the journey of hope. Because
thank you very much. It was so good to be with all of you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
With you. Thank you, Ilan. You made our webinar very meaningful.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to say thank you to both of you, even though we've just lost Ilan. I think that we heard so much that was valuable, and for those who needed to understand better what the roots of this conflict are about, I think they had a great opportunity to learn from both of you. So, Bridget, I'm going to turn this back over to you now. Thanks.
Thanks everyone for joining us. As we've mentioned before, this has been recorded and it will be shared in the next couple of days. You'll also probably receive an email with a recording. It'll be up on both of our YouTube channels and websites. That's UMKR and MFSA. We will also be coming and gathering again for another conversation in July. And so if this is the first time with us, you will be added to our email list and you'll get further information on our next webinar in July. So I hope that you can join us, and we please also ask that you share, share the recording, invite others into this conversation. Thank you again, and we will see you in July.